Introduction to the incident. It was supposed to be a typical first day in a small, quiet town. My name's Michael, 50 years old, and I just accepted a position as the new chief of police. I've been around long enough to know that small towns have their own rhythms, their own quirks. But nothing prepared me for the welcome I was about to receive. I didn't make a grand entrance, no sirens, no spotlight. Just a man in his worn boots, an old jacket, and a cap pulled low to blend in. I was hoping to get a feel for the town before I reported in for duty. As I wandered down the main street, I felt every pair of eyes on me. It wasn't a welcoming stare, no, it was the kind of look you give someone who clearly doesn't belong. I stopped by a café, the kind that felt stuck in time, walls decorated with faded pictures and old signs. I ordered my coffee, just a regular guy trying to fit in, but the moment I stepped inside, I knew something was off. In the back corner, two officers were laughing, sharing jokes at my expense. They were sizing me up, as if I was just another outsider they could poke fun at. I didn't bite back. I ordered my coffee, played it cool, but I could feel the tension rise as I moved toward the door. The following morning, I decided to get some fresh air. A little jog outside of town, I figured, would help me clear my head. But as fate would have it, I crossed paths with those same officers, Jake and Tom. They pulled up beside me in their patrol car. With a grin that made my skin crawl, Jake leaned out the window and shouted, "Hey, you lost or something?" I slowed my pace, keeping my response simple, "Just running." "Are you sure you're welcome here?" Tom chimed in, his bulk casting a shadow over me. Before I could even process the comment, they were out of the car, hands on my arms, dragging me to the center of town. No questions, no explanation, just a display. They walked me straight to a lamp post in the middle of the square, tying me up like some show for the locals to watch. I knew they didn't recognize me. They had no idea who I was about to be. It wasn't just another bad joke anymore. It was something far deeper. Something that was going to change everything. But, at that moment, I stayed silent, watching them as they took their little victory lap, unaware that they had just set the stage for a much larger story to unfold. The hostile welcome. The moment I stepped foot in this small town, I knew things weren't going to be as smooth as I hoped. My name's John, and I'd just been appointed as the new chief of police in a place that seemed a world apart from where I'd come. The folks here, well, they weren't exactly thrilled about a stranger in their midst. I'd been through plenty of small towns, but this one felt different, like it carried a certain kind of unspoken tension. On my first day, I didn't dive into the office right away. Instead, I decided to take a walk and get the lay of the land. You know, just see what I was working with. I was dressed simply, nothing flashy, just a man in an old jacket, trying to blend in. I strolled down the main street, passing by shops that had seen better days. As I walked past a local diner, I felt it, the weight of a dozen stares on me. People were sizing me up, making it clear I was an outsider. But it was the two officers sitting by the window that caught my attention. Jake and Tom. I could tell by the way they were laughing, the way their eyes kept flicking toward me. They weren't laughing with me, they were laughing at me. Their snide remarks hung in the air as they mocked the newcomer. I felt like I was part of some joke I wasn't in on. But I didn't react, I kept my cool. It was just a bad vibe, right? Nothing more. I grabbed a coffee, paid, and walked out. But they weren't done with me yet. The next morning, as I took a jog to clear my mind, I spotted the same patrol car creeping up beside me. I had no reason to be worried. I wasn't doing anything wrong. Still, the way they looked at me, it was as if I didn't belong, like I was trespassing in their world. "You lost?" Jake's voice cut through the morning air, dripping with sarcasm. Tom, his hulking partner, leaned out of the car window, eyes scanning me like I was some kind of threat. "Just getting some exercise," I replied, trying to brush off the uncomfortable feeling gnawing at me. "Don't think you're really welcome here," Tom muttered, his grin far too wide for comfort. Before I could respond, they were out of the car. Jake grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the town square, where people were already beginning to gather. I couldn't understand what was happening. I'd done nothing wrong. But there I was, dragged into the heart of the town, under the spotlight, while people watched from the sidelines. They tied me to the lamp post in the middle of the square, making a mockery of me for all to see. It wasn't just about showing off in front of the town, it was about power, control, and making sure that the outsider knew his place. They laughed, cracked jokes, and mocked me like I was just some insignificant stranger. The crowd pulled out their phones, recording every moment like it was some twisted form of entertainment. Some people shook their heads, others chuckled. It was as if this was just another day for them. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just about a couple of officers having fun. No, this was about disrespect, about humiliating anyone who wasn't part of the club. And while they had their little moment, I stood there, calm and quiet, knowing full well that the game they were playing was about to blow up in their faces. What they didn't know was that this wasn't the end, it was just the beginning. And I wasn't going to let them get away with it. The backlash begins. It didn't take long for the scene to spiral out of control. What those two officers, Jake and Tom, thought would be a small, humiliating prank quickly turned into something much bigger. Something they never saw coming. The moment I was tied to that lamp post, the crowd, phones in hand, started recording. The looks of amusement and indifference from the onlookers were chilling, but it wasn't just the people around town that were watching. By the time I was finally untied, the video was already spreading like wildfire. Clips flooded social media platforms, each one showing me, the so-called outsider, being treated like some kind of circus act. By the next morning, it was everywhere: local news, online forums, even national outlets were catching wind of the story. People from across the country had something to say about it. The comments started pouring in: "Who is this man? Why would the cops do this?" And then, of course, a few that made my blood run cold: "What's the point of a new chief of police if this is how they treat outsiders?" The town that I'd walked into, expecting a fresh start, was now under intense scrutiny. What was once seen as a harmless tradition, a way to keep the outsiders in check, was now being called out for what it truly was: an abuse of power, a disgrace. It didn't take long for reporters to show up, cameras in tow, desperate for answers. They pressed through the crowd, hunting for a story, demanding to know why the town's law enforcement was involved in such a spectacle. At first, the officers in town tried to dismiss it. It was just a prank, they said, nothing serious. But the backlash was relentless. The video was everywhere, and people weren't buying the harmless fun excuse. Those who had once chuckled at the antics were now looking at Jake and Tom with disgust. The support they'd once enjoyed from the community quickly evaporated. It wasn't long before the town started to turn against them. The same people who had been passive, maybe even entertained, by the officers' behavior were now demanding answers. The town's leaders, the ones who had brushed things off as tradition, were suddenly under pressure. This wasn't a small town secret anymore, it was a public scandal. And it was clear that the officers involved, and anyone who had turned a blind eye, were about to face the consequences. As the story spread, I could feel a shift in the air. The silence in the streets had been replaced with murmurs, with people finally seeing this behavior for what it truly was. The community wasn't just upset anymore, they were angry. And that anger was about to boil over, bringing with it the kind of accountability no one could ignore. The reveal. I walked into the police station the next morning, fully aware of the weight I was carrying. Today wasn't just another day in the office. No, today was the day I would confront Jake and Tom, the officers who thought they could get away with humiliating me, with treating me like I was nothing. They had no idea what they were messing with. They had no idea who I really was. When I entered the main hall, I could hear their laughter from the other room, Jake's voice booming like he owned the place. But the moment they saw me, fully dressed in my chief's uniform, everything changed. The laughter died. Their faces froze, expressions slowly shifting from cocky confidence to a shade of fear they couldn't hide. I didn't rush. I didn't say a word. I just stood there, calm, composed, watching as the realization hit them. They had no idea who I was when they tied me up the day before. But now, with my uniform and badge gleaming, they understood that they had crossed a line. Jake stammered something, trying to explain himself, but I raised my hand, cutting him off. "Save it, Jake," I said, my voice firm. "I know exactly what's been going on here." Their eyes darted around the room, trying to find an escape, but there was no way out. I pulled out my phone, the one I'd used to record their little show from yesterday. I hit play, and the video filled the room. There they were, Jake and Tom, mocking me, tying me to that lamp post for all to see. Their words were crystal clear. "Looks like we got ourselves a troublemaker," Jake had sneered. And the crowd that cheered them on, that watched as I was humiliated. As the video played, I could see the color drain from their faces. Jake opened his mouth, but no words came out. He was speechless. But Tom tried to defend their actions, muttering something about how this was just a tradition. "We've always done it this way," he said, trying to justify the inexcusable. I shook my head. "Tradition?" I echoed, my voice colder now. "You think humiliating people is a tradition? You think making someone feel worthless is just part of the job?" The room was dead silent. My words hung in the air, sharp and unforgiving. The officers in the room, those who had stood by, turned a blind eye to what Jake and Tom had been doing, were now watching, their faces full of disbelief. They knew this wasn't something that could be swept under the rug. This was bigger than just a couple of officers making a bad decision. As the video ended, I didn't waste another second. I pulled out the papers, signed them right in front of them. "Jake. Tom. Hand over your badges. You're done here." The room was heavy with silence, the weight of what had just happened settling over everyone. Jake and Tom didn't put up a fight. They knew, as I handed them their termination forms, that their time was up. They had underestimated me, and now the town was about to see the consequences of their actions. Consequences and change. The moment the termination papers were handed to Jake and Tom, everything in that room shifted. No more jokes. No more games. The air was thick with tension as they stood there, their hands trembling as they accepted the reality of what had just happened. The laughter that had once filled the halls of this station was gone, replaced by a silence so heavy it was suffocating. "Effective immediately," I said, my voice unwavering, "any behavior that disrespects this community or undermines its trust will result in termination. No exceptions. No second chances." Jake and Tom didn't argue. They didn't protest. They stood there, looking like two men who had just realized how much they had lost. Their badges, once symbols of power, were now just pieces of metal. I could see the humiliation in their eyes as they turned in their insignia. They had crossed a line, and now the consequences were clear. As they left the station, there was no applause, no cheers. Just a cold, heavy silence. The real work was just beginning. News of their firing spread quickly through the town. What had been a local incident had become a full-blown scandal. The community, once passive in the face of this kind of behavior, was now awake. People who had kept their heads down, too afraid to speak out, were now sharing their stories. Stories of mistreatment, of being humiliated or mistreated by Jake and Tom. Stories of things that had been swept under the rug, ignored by everyone. The prosecutor's office began to dig into their history, going through every arrest, every report, and every complaint. It didn't take long before a mountain of evidence piled up. These weren't isolated incidents. These weren't just two bad apples. This was a pattern of abuse that had been allowed to fester under the radar for far too long. And the people? They weren't backing down. They flooded the streets, demanding justice, holding signs, and chanting for accountability. What had started as a single act of humiliation had now become a movement. The people were done turning a blind eye. They were done accepting this kind of behavior. They wanted change, and they wanted it now. As I stood in the midst of it all, watching the community come together, I realized that this wasn't just about two officers being held accountable. It was about the town reclaiming its dignity. It was about people finding their voices and demanding the respect they deserved. And in that moment, I knew, this town was never going to be the same again. Things were changing, and I was here to make sure they stayed that way. The aftermath. The day Jake and Tom were fired was only the beginning of a much larger reckoning. What had started as a simple act of public humiliation had turned into a full-blown investigation. Once the prosecutor's office got involved, it didn't take long to uncover the dark truth. What we had all witnessed in that moment, Jake and Tom tying me to that lamp post, was just the tip of the iceberg. The investigation revealed a long history of misconduct, of abuse, and of officers using their badges to intimidate, humiliate, and control. The more the prosecutors dug, the more they uncovered unlawful arrests, excessive force, and a culture of bullying that had gone unchecked for far too long. People came forward, victims who had stayed silent for years, finally finding the courage to speak out. And as the truth came to light, it wasn't just about two bad officers anymore. It was about an entire system that had allowed them to act with impunity. But something incredible started to happen. The town that had once turned a blind eye to these abuses was now united, standing together for justice. The community, which had silently endured these wrongs, was now demanding change. People who had once feared speaking up were now coming forward with their stories, sharing their pain, and holding those responsible accountable. It was as if a weight had been lifted, and for the first time in years, the town was free to stand tall again. And I was leading the charge. It wasn't just about punishing Jake and Tom, it was about creating a culture of respect and accountability, where people no longer had to fear the ones who were supposed to protect them. As the new chief, I made it clear, this town would not tolerate any form of disrespect, and any officer who crossed that line would face consequences. It wasn't going to be easy. There would be challenges, setbacks, and resistance. But the people had spoken, and they weren't backing down. They wanted justice, and they weren't going to stop until they got it. Now, I want to hear from you. What do you think about the way this town handled the situation? Do you think we can change a system that's been broken for so long? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and let's talk about it. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you can stay updated on all the latest stories. We're just getting started, and together, we can make a difference.